News when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Dan Schwarzman. The Supreme Court has struck down President Trump's sweeping global tariffs. In a 6-3 ruling, the court said Trump exceeded his authority by invoking a federal emergency powers law to impose his, quote, reciprocal tariffs across the globe, as well as targeted import taxes the administration says address fentanyl trafficking. Jennifer Hillman, Georgetown law professor and former vice chair of the U.S. Internal Trade Commission and a former member of the World Trade Organization appellate body, says this is a win for America.
This is a big victory for American consumers, but I would argue from a legal perspective that it's an even bigger victory for the U.S. Constitution, because what this is basically saying is the court is acknowledging that the Constitution gives to the Congress, not to the president, the power to impose tariffs. And so this ruling is saying that the president cannot use this IEEPA statute that doesn't even have the word tariff or duty in it to somehow turn it into a tariff statute.
That's Georgetown law professor Jennifer Hillman. The Supreme Court ruling against President Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act lowers the average U.S. effective tariff rate from 13.6% down to 6.5%. That's still higher than the 2.3% rate when Trump took office last January. The administration has indicated it intends to move quickly to replace many of the tariffs through other authorities. Dorsey and Whitney trade attorney Dave Townsend says there's one thing that was surprising about this opinion.
How definitive it was with respect to the statutory interpretation question. The lower courts had been maybe a bit more measured. They had said that the use of the IEEPA authority had exceeded what IEEPA was intended to permit. And the Supreme Court, it looks to me, went one step further and said that the language of the statute doesn't permit tariffs, full stop.
That's Dorsey and Whitney trade attorney Dave Townsend. David Weston of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, who also clerked for Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, asks an important question now that the ruling has come down.
One of the big questions, obviously, is going to be what's the remedy? I mean, what do you go from here? Is there a refund? There have been refunds in the past, but they've been in much smaller situations. I mean, much lower numbers of dollars involved. I don't know, the estimates I see, it was $134 billion as of December. The estimates now, I think, are like $170 billion that might be refunded here.
That's David Weston of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. Markets reacting to the Supreme Court ruling striking down President Trump's tariffs, with the Dow gaining around 0.1%, the S&P up close to 0.5%, while the Nasdaq has gained over 0.8%. The 10-year Treasury yield is at 4.091. The 2-year is at 3.483. Gold trading at $5,070 an ounce, while Bitcoin is at close to $67,300. President Trump, speaking to reporters at the opening of a breakfast with governors at the White House, says he is considering limited strikes on Iran as a way to ramp up pressure on the regime to make a deal to limit its nuclear program. The U.S. military has been building up a massive armada in the Middle East, including 2 aircraft carriers, hundreds of fighter jets and refueling tankers, along with thousands of troops. The president has said Iran has 10 to 15 days to strike a deal over its nuclear program. The U.S. economy grew less than expected at the end of last year, dragged down by a record-long government shutdown, consumer spending, and trade. Bloomberg's Michael McKee with more details.
Now, the inflation numbers, the price index on a month-over-month basis up 0.4. On a year-over-year basis, it goes up from 2.8% to 2.9%, so a rise in the headline. The core up 0.4, and the core year-over-year is up to 3% from 2.8%. That is something that does not look particularly good if the Fed wants to cut interest rates again.
That's Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Meanwhile, the Bureau of Economic Analysis said the reduction in federal services during the shutdown subtracted about 1 percentage point from GDP, which contradicted President Trump, who posted on social media an hour before the release of the data that the shutdown would cost the U.S., quote, at least 2 points in GDP. U.S. consumer sentiment rising less than expected in February as optimism among wealthier Americans was offset by declining confidence among those who haven't benefited from stock market gains. People's perception of their current financial situation did improve in February, but 46% of consumers mentioned that high prices were eroding their personal finances. Jeffrey Epstein's estate and his 2 co-executors have agreed to pay as much as $35 million to resolve outstanding legal claims of his victims who have not already reached settlements. The proposed settlement plan is intended to resolve all remaining claims with a class of women who say they were abused sexually or trafficked by Epstein between 1995 and 2019. That's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Dan Schwarzman, and this is Bloomberg.